Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the Friday edition of The Daily Friend, the filmed version on YouTube. I'm joined here with a pretty interesting panel. We've got our CEO, Dr. Frans Cronje.
Nice to be here, Nick.
Very good to have you. We've got Gabriel Crouse.
Greetings.
And Hermann Pretorius.
Hello.
Right, so we'll start off with something Hermann's been talking about a lot recently. We've been running a campaign on this, which is to do with our education system. So recently, of course, we've had our matric results, and on the surface, they show the best results that we've ever had as a country since 1994 in terms of pass rate. But there's a lot more going on here, which suggests that the pass rate figure is really not a good indication of the quality of our education. Hermann, why don't you tell us a little bit more about that and what our campaign is about?
Yeah, let me start with what the campaign is about. We here at the IRR, people like Dr. Anthea Jeffrey and France and so on have spent decades studying ANC ideology and approach to policy formation. And what we decided to do is essentially try and give a view into the future. If you want to know what the future of ANC education policy is going to be, what should you look for? And we determined that Gauteng would be a pretty good bellwether province, as it were, because for various reasons, Mr. Lesufi, the MEC for Education in Gauteng, is seen as a pioneer, gold standard within the ANC.
And it's a fairly well-resourced province.
And it's a very, very well-resourced province. It's quite urbanized, and South Africa will see more urbanization over the next few years. So if you really want to know what's going to happen with education, Gauteng is a pretty good place to look. And I think one of the substantiations for that position is in May in 2019, after the ANC retained the government of Gauteng. Mr. Lesufi was to be moved from the education portfolio to the finance portfolio. And then the Minister for Basic Education, Angie Motshekga, said, no, that's a, quote, big mistake. So if you want to know who listens to whom on education within the ANC, then, Mr. Lesufi is pretty much at the top of that food chain, or pretty close. And even if you listen to what's coming down the tracks on the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, that isn't public yet, but that I've spoken to people about, Mr. Lesufi's ideas, or Mr. Lesufi himself was involved in that. So that's the broad, context of the report. So if you want to know what's going to happen, the successes and failure of Gauteng is a pretty good indication of where the ANC would want to go. And what you see in Gauteng is an increasingly powerful government locally, very aggressive and strict zoning, and even according to the Department of Basic Education, a healthy dose of SATU influence. So to answer your second question, actually, the matric pass rate is just a snapshot, and congratulations to those matrics who did well. That's wonderful. But you've got a 12-year race here, and along the way you need to find out how many people you're losing. And if you look at the class of 2005 or 2006, you get about 1.2 million grade 1s coming into the system. And then 12 years later, on bachelor passes, you have 13%. But to me, the most worrying statistic is, or number, from that original 1.2 million kids nationwide in grade 1, you only get 55,000 passing matric in mathematics with more than 50%. And if you take into consideration two things, firstly, that our economy is between a fourth and a fifth dependent on our financial sector, then there's going to be a problem there, getting people who can actually do mathematics to go into that sector. And on a human level, what is happening to these kids? And that's why we titled the thing Thrown Under the School Bus, because the more government intrudes, the less freedom we have. And parents, even on Twitter, you see loyal ANC people telling Mr. Lesufi, you failed us because your government overreach has made it difficult for my son to get into a school. And it's shocking. And the people who are suffering, actually, aren't your white middle-class people. It is either your black middle-class people or even in a less socioeconomically well-off bracket, because these people are just being taken for granted and taken for fools.
All right, so what is the solution then? What is the alternative to Lesufi's vision for the future?
Parental input. Parents should, to coin a phrase, take back control. You've got this whole situation where accountability in IRR research, on accountability in schools, if you have a parent being able to actually hold the school governing body or hold a position within the school governing body, and the SGB has a powerful input and accountability in the standards of the school, you have better results. And research published in May 2018 by John Hermann supports this. He looks at a township low-fee paying privately run school and compares that school to other state-run township schools, and there are double-digit differences in pass rates. So it's not that township kids are stupid or South African kids are stupid, it's that you don't have parents able to hold the feet to the fire of those people who are actually determining the quality of education.
The research is unambiguous, Nick, that we've done. And it comes down to the fact that parents take better decisions about their children than bureaucrats do.
Unsurprising.
And in South African education, it's not a question of money or resources, and we've established that over very many years. Allow parents and communities to take charge of what happens in their schools and the results of the kids in those schools, regardless of socioeconomic bracket or quintile or whatever, improves immediately.
And there's this, I think, this silent assumption that because a lot of South Africans are poor and uneducated, they will make stupid decisions for their kids on education. But it's fascinating to look at research done by Thomas Sowell about the freed slaves in the American South between 1860 and 1960. Each generation of former slaves and their descendants were better educated and better off, even though in that 100 years the government did nothing for them. I mean, if former slaves can rise to the dignity of being brilliant parents, what's the excuse the ANC is giving this country that South Africans can't do the same?
Well, we know what the excuse is. The excuse is that the syllabus is too Eurocentric or too West-oriented, and that we need to do more decolonization. And I think that it's sort of part of a broader political game of make you look, where if you have a serious problem, you point the finger another way and try and make it about some culture war that has very little traction when you're trying to get kids to understand basic arithmetic and the force of gravity being a universal thing. And
again, it gets back to the fundamental question of ideologies. What's the role of the government? What's the role of the state? And on every possible policy front, the ANC says more government, more state, and education perhaps should be one of those areas that gains more focus because it has a human cost of vulnerable kids. That's something perhaps like, the mismanagement of SOEs doesn't necessarily have on such an obviously visible, you're throwing kids under the school bus level.
But there's something else that also lurks beneath. And sometimes it's difficult to say where incompetence ends and malice begins. But polls seem now to suggest very clearly that where people are better educated and better able to think for themselves, they are less inclined to vote for the ANC.
Yeah.
And the ANC is politically back to the wall. If you look at age structure of the country's population, and I don't think we go as far as to say that the ANC expressly intends to destroy the quality of education. But I think knowing that every chap that you educate really well is quite likely to look at an opposition party before they look at you when it comes to voting, it's the wrong incentive to take the big, bold decisions you need to actually fix the education system. You might drag your feet, understanding the political implications of setting right the quality of schooling. And Gauteng has become a very good case study of exactly that.
So, Hermann, how can people support our campaign?
Well, firstly, of course, on our website, we have a hashtag free education campaign. Now, just to clear that up, that is deliberate, linguistic appropriation. We need to start calling these things out for what they are. Free education in the general sense is perhaps a populist touch point. But if we want to free education from the clutches of the politician, then that's a different free education that I think all South African parents can get behind. So firstly, go on our website, or you can SMS LEARN to 32823. But that's how you can join the IRR and get involved with us. But on another level, I would just advise parents to become absolute nuisances to their schools, demand better from their schools, hound your local Department of Education, and don't take no for an answer. And because, parents will fight to the death for their kids. And I don't want to say, sounds that melodramatic here, but I think a fight is necessary, perhaps not to the death, but start being a nuisance to these people.
All right, well, that's very interesting. Please do check out our website and support our campaign. It's a very important issue. So I'd like to move on to Frans. You've written a interesting piece about what we sort of can expect are going to be the major things that will impact ordinary people's lives over the next year. What is it that we have to look out for?
Many things. Our Daily Friend editor, the written version of the Daily Friend, Michael Morris, asked us last year to come up with the big issues that people need to watch out for in the year and make hard calls on how they're going to play out. And a number of us have been working on this document now for a number of weeks. And it's not completely finished yet, but we hope it will be finished on Sunday when we're going to publish it on the Daily Friend. And the 10 things that we take ourselves through, number one for us was US government debt. And is there a US government debt crisis pending, and what would the implications be for South Africa? And Michael said, you guys need to make hard calls, no fence sitting on which way you believe it goes. And we are at an answer there, and we'll develop it a bit further. You'll read it on Sunday. Number two for us was the US equity market, sky high. Record high at a very volatile time around the world. And what do we anticipate there? Is there a great global equities pullback waiting in the wings just weeks away, or otherwise not? And the call we made there is no, not at least before November, when the US presidential election plays out. Number three was China and Hong Kong. And the question there is, not just can China get its hands on, can it get a handle on events in Hong Kong, but can it prevent the very well-off East Coast developing into a whole lot of little Hong Kongs, as inspired by the rebellious Hong Kong protesters? And the answer there for us was that in the fullness of time, we think China gets a handle on Hong Kong. Then, of course, there's the question of Brexit. We called this last year, that it would happen successfully. There was one little intervening election that we didn't anticipate would be necessary, but we got that call absolutely right. How will Brexit play out through the year? What will the implications be? We answer that one. Huge, number five, is the US election. Who is going to win? And head on a block, IRR prediction, Mr. Trump is going to win in November. And if you read us on Sunday, we'll tell you why we think that is going to be the case. Then to our own president, Mr. Ramaphosa, will he survive very much longer? I increasingly think that's unlikely. I think he's vulnerable to being removed, although his adversaries may wait until 2022 to remove him. But ever more to me, I think he is a one-term president. And we explain that case. From him and his party and government and the ANC, we move to the question of the DA and can it maintain its internal cohesion through this year? And last year, we stick with this view. In a note to a bank last year, we said that the sustainability of the DA is something that must still be established. And we will explain some of the reasons for that view on Sunday. Then the question of expropriation without compensation. What will the government do? We think it will proceed exactly as it has said it intends to proceed, although we think within these 12 calendar months to the end of December, it might stop short of actual mass implementation of the seizure of assets. Moodys, our call there is, they are definitely going to downgrade us. They should have done that a while ago, although they might have the decency to wait until after the budget speech in order to make that announcement. And number 10, if you don't think there's enough to worry about, is the question of Eskom. Is there a reform plan for Eskom? Will one be forthcoming? And our answer to that, very briefly, the detail you will read on Sunday, is no. There is no plan. There is no practical solution. And if I read the IRR prediction here, more smoke and mirrors, rabbits to be pulled out of hats, and a government that seeks to create false horizons in an effort to maintain some measure of business and investor confidence.
Well, that's fairly ominous, and you will be able to find that article on thedailyfriend.co.za, I believe, where it will be published in full, and you can read all of our reasoning and predictions and exactly why we're saying what we're saying. A lot of these are pretty important calls. They will affect the sort of economy of South Africa and the globe, and they will affect your life, especially very obviously in the case of Eskom.
It is ominous.
Yeah.
I think we've got to have an ominous mood in our building.
Well, I did say in one of our final podcasts of last year that I believed that hope had died in 2019, and with looking at this list, it feels a little bit like that maybe.
But hope is also the last refuge of the desperate man, and sometimes you need hope to die for people to actually focus on the crux of issues.
No, exactly.
And get away from silly concepts and realize what types of hard reforms need to be executed in order for progress to be made. So I'm in ominous, yes, for the year ahead and a little bit of time beyond that. But in the much longer term, don't be
despondent.
Don't reject the thesis that sort of rock bottom is sometimes a good impetus for real structural reform, and perhaps we need a few little rock bottom moments.
Yeah, so the thing that you really need to get rid of is complacency.
Yes.
I think that South Africa has got a bit of a complacency issue. I like Jared Diamond's line that when civilizations really collapse, it's because their greatest strength, the defining characteristic that's persisted across various changes and has helped them get through problems, becomes exactly the problem itself that they can't address. And I think in South Africa's case, the sense that things will work themselves out has allowed for many transitions that have been substantial to take place in less violent ways than many people would have expected, in less economically catastrophic ways than people would have expected. But right now, complacency has become our greatest weakness. Yes. And I think for South Africans to start taking seriously the thought that nothing does work out unless you do it yourself. There is no change except for the change you make yourself. These are sort of platitudes that sound very hollow in an American can-do sort of spirit context, but I think are unusual in this country, and I think that it's something that we can hopefully look forward to. If I can drill down to a specific, and it relates to one of our predictions, sort of sense in which South Africa is does stand a chance in the longer term of doing really well. We were talking about the rand, the value of the rand. By certain measures, the rand is hugely undervalued.
I think there was a news report yesterday that said 62% undervalued.
So what does that mean? It means economists really keep two sets of books around how value works. One is price. Something is just as valuable as the price you're willing to pay for it. And if you're really willing to pay 10,000 Rand for a Justin Bieber concert ticket, then that's what it's worth. I can't see the value myself outside of that, but hey, knock yourself out. There's another kind of value that we try to suppose, a real value that the prices do well to track. And it's by having that concept in mind that you can think of a bubble being sort of an asset price that increases far above the real value of the thing. So to say the rand is undervalued is to say, well, people are only willing to pay for a rand at this rate. But and at some deep level, they should be willing to pay for a rand it should be a different rate. Why is that? Well, you look at basically the amount of goods and services that are being produced in this country. You look at them in other countries. You look at the inflation rates comparatively, and you see how the currency should sort of make up for the difference. If you have one country increasing its GDP substantially, not with a lot of inflation, and the other one having a bit of inflation, not growing so much, there should be a difference that's matched up by a currency revaluation. It's that kind of calculation, looking at sort of how many goods and services are being chased around by how many rands, that suggests that we should have a stronger rand than we do. Why do we have a weak rand? Well, it's because a currency is a medium of exchange. It's a thing you do deals with, but it's also a store of value. And as a store of value, the rand is perceived, I think correctly, to be a very poor bet right now. It's a hard place to hold on to your wealth when the government talks about taking wealth from people without any compensation. And so
when they talk about nationalizing the Reserve Bank.
When they talk about nationalizing the Reserve Bank, there's a potential of just printing free money, which changes the value of the currency. When you talk about prescribed assets, it's also alarming to potential investors. So for all of these reasons, you have a pressure on the weakening of the rand. one of the things that people will be worried about in the context of the Moody downgrade is that the rand then weakens substantially further, and that we might sit in an even more sort of bizarre situation where the rand goes from being 60% undervalued to 100% undervalued or something like that. Could this happen? I think the answer is yes. But as Frans and I have discussed at length, we think that that there's likely to be a bounce back. See, the problem is bonds, when they get junked by the rating agencies, become impossible to purchase for the poorest people, effectively. Those people who can't afford to lose money on a bet take the safest bets. The safest bets in the world are bonds. So pension funds have mandates, fiduciaries are obliged to bet on very safe things like bonds. When the rating agencies say this bond is no longer a bond, it's a chip in a casino, they can't buy into that. And so that's why the price will fall down, because they'll have to sell off at whatever price they can. But other players will step in. People who can go to a casino and place big bets, cowboys with fancy hats and Gucci shoes, can stroll along and lap up South African bonds. Why? Because the spread, the difference between the coupons you get on a South African bond and the coupons you get on a European or American bond are enormous, 5%. In many cases, and our bonds, and we're issuing South African bonds in euro denominations, which means they don't have to worry about the currency fluctuating. What's the upshot? The upshot is that Pravin Gordhan, the great communist socialist who's been celebrated by the Business Day this week as a sort of awesome hero of the country, doubled our debt from 30% of GDP to 60% and 100%, including our state-owned enterprises. That debt, that's money we as South Africans all have to pay back. And now who's going to own that debt? Not even pensioners, not even the poorest of the poor. All of it is going to be owned by cowboys. That is how you increase inequality, decrease efficiency, and immiserate an economy. And that's what we've managed to do. And it's going to take serious structural reform to undo that problem.
A strange thing could also happen in our thinking about the rand and the Moody's downgrade. That is that if you're going to be downgraded to junk by all three big agencies, and then you get knocked out of the global bond index, and now is a wonderful time for that to happen to you as a country, because we've got the good fortune of it happening at a point when interest rates around the world are very, very low. And you've got a figure we came up with last year, $17 trillion invested around the world at negative yields. And what that may mean is that the immediate short-term consequence of that Moody's downgrade may not be to see the devaluation, the extent of devaluation move from 60% to 100%. You might even, now that there's the certainty that the downgrade has happened, see these yield-seeking, desperate for yield. There's none in most other parts of the world. Bond cowboys enter the South African bond market, buy more bonds with the effect of even holding the currency at its present rate, or at least slowing the extent of its weakening, and perhaps even seeing yields come off a bit, all of which will be interpreted by the government as signs of confidence in the South African economy. But it is anything but that. And also why we think the post-Moody's Rand event might be more muted than the more dire predictions suggest is that a lot of this is, of course, priced in. In serious places, a term we use more often, it's very well understood that this has to happen. And it seems at times that it's really only the editors of some of the country's newspapers and the president who express shock and surprise at the lights going out, the downgrades occurring, or whatever.
Or capital equity flight.
Whatever other horrors still lie in wait. So Moody's downgrades are called in this paper, this Sunday's paper this year. But perhaps the immediate effect on the currency, not as dire as people think, but in the longer term, you place that much of your debt in the hands of real cowboys, and the day will come when you will regret that position.
Yes, well, that's something to watch out for. But I think the sort of message I'm getting from what you guys are saying is that while to use that line from the Batman movie, the night is darkest just before the dawn, is that there's a lot of potential that can come out of the situation that the country is in right now. There's a sort of silver linings we can.
If you have a proper understanding of time, then yes, I agree with you completely. If you're obsessed about the next quarter or the next year or what will happen in the next election, then you'll be a bit worried about things. But if you understand how societies change, how pressure breeds reform, and you have a longer term perspective, which is luxury that we have in a lot of the work that we do, then I think there are upsides for South Africa, but they will only really be triggered, I think, once it becomes more publicly and well understood and articulated that what the real deeper reasons are for the trouble that we're in the country. There's nothing like the lights going out, downgrades, big currency devaluations, rising unemployment to start taking us
shake the tree a bit
to that point.
Yeah, I mean, the worry is to not fall into the trap of trying to finish on a positive note. Is that that's exactly correct. There's this battle, however, between reality and those organs of the information network that gatekeep what is taboo to say and what may be said and what is in fact celebrated to say. What you can do on the public stage that gets you 1 million likes and what gets you shunned into the corners of the shadows. And our gatekeepers of information have committed themselves over the last decade very heavily to, if not the individuals, the ideologies and the norms that have brought us until this point. And so it's hard to see the proper structural reforms that the country needs taking place without one of two things happening. Either those gatekeepers being replaced by new upcoming information platforms, or by them having a change of heart and saying, look, it's not just a problem that we supported Julius Malema and then discovered through the VBS thing that he's corrupt. It's a problem that we supported those ideas. We were misled, we were mistaken, but we didn't call it right in terms of what this country needs. And I think if one of those two things doesn't happen, then information and reality, the way we understand reality and the way it is, are going to continue to collide to our detriment.
There's a very good example of this at the moment, which is for all that is written and said about Eskom, described by business as the greatest crisis facing the country. There's talk of corruption, state capture as the reasons, a lack of planning, lack of maintenance. But no one has interrogated what was perhaps the most prominent of policies driven by the government, proudly adopted by Eskom, which was employment equity in that organisation and BE procurement.
Yeah.
And what that suggests, it should at least be interrogated whether those policies contributed to the crisis. That does not happen at all.
Yeah.
Is to show that the gatekeepers of opinion and ideas are not yet at a point themselves where they feel sufficiently up against it to be bold enough to explore some of the possible reasons for the problem.
But in a way it's worse than that, because Gwen Ngwenya, for example, wrote lucidly about employment equity and procurement being a major cause of the problems at Eskom. She published that. She published it on Politics Web. We know that other media houses have noticed that, have picked that up, know that she makes that argument. If they've got good counter arguments, they could level them against her. There could be explicit criticism with her analysis, but it's not even criticized. It's ignored. And I think it was Mahatma Gandhi who said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they take you seriously. We're still at the stage where the people who are bold enough to make serious analysis of our problems, to look into the mirror of the South African dilemma and say, what do we do about this, are not even being laughed at yet. We're still being ignored. And I think that the time is ticking. And the problem with anyone who thinks Ramaphosa there's a long-term strategy here for pulling us out is that we don't have a long-term allowance to make the changes that we need to make.
Okay, so what then should South Africans do to deal with this complacency, with this sort of coming dark period in our economy and our society?
The rule's always the same, Nick. You firstly must understand what is going on and why, and that will stretch from the factual understanding of matters on the ground to an understanding of the ideologies that drive government policy. Number one, know what's going on. If you don't actually know what the problem is, if you don't understand the extent to which ideology is central to the problem of Eskom, then how can you possibly address it? Once you are understanding the problem, you must be organized. Remain an independent actor all on your own and no measure of political organization behind it. And you might know very well, but you cannot bring to bear any pressure. Once you are politically well organized, the third step is to apply pressure. Pressure breeds reform. Politics is about forcing balances of power. And the more pressure you can bring to bear on the institutions and individuals within the whatever realm or scope of influence you may have, the greater a positive role you're playing in helping South Africa make progress to the point of reform.
All right, very well said. So there's a program of action that our viewers can take on to help rescue our country from its dire state. So thank you very much for watching us. We will catch you on the Monday edition, also when we have our podcast released. If you want to support the Institute of Race Relations, you can SMS your name to 32823. SMSs cost R1 and terms and conditions apply. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to the panel. And we will see you on the next edition of The Daily Friend.